Hi, welcome to the Russian History Podcast. This is episode 116, The Grand Embassy. Thanks again for joining me. Last week we covered the Second Azov campaign, which resulted in Russia taking and holding the fortress of Azov, which, by extension, gave Russia access to the Sea of Azov and new trade opportunities. With that in mind, Russia does have the port of Arkhangelsk, which lies on the White Sea already. However, that port is blocked for between 5 to 7 months of the year by the ice that forms around it. Therefore, Azov, and its new port, is Russia's only port that can, theoretically, accept goods all year around, and without fear that those ships heading to it won't be lost to the elements and the sea ice. This week we're going to look at the period of time that has become known as Peter's Grand, or Great, depending on your translation, embassy. Yes, I realise I said last week that we'll be looking at Peter's reforms, but that's now going to come next week. So, what is this Grand Embassy? I can already hear yourself ask. Well, in effect, it's a diplomatic tour of Europe where, for the first time so far in Russian history, the Tsar is going to travel to the courts of Western Europe and try to drop alliances and trade agreements, as well as learn a thing or two that can be brought back home. In total, there was around half a dozen objectives that this diplomatic mission had, which can roughly be summarised as 1. Gain agreement from those countries not already at war with the Ottomans to enter the fray. 2. As part of that war against the Ottomans, lobby for support for the transfer of the Black Sea coast to be transferred to Russia. Whether this included Constantinople or not isn't entirely clear. 3. Raise the prestige of both Peter and Russia by reporting on the success at Azov the previous year. 4. For those countries in the north of Europe, begin to form a coalition against Sweden, and more on this later. 5. Recruit foreign specialists in just about every trade imaginable and every subject you can think of to come to Russia for work, and most notably this is going to be weaponsmiths and shipbuilders. And then finally 6. To gain an understanding of the bureaucracies and workings of foreign nations. So yeah, quite lofty aims and far-reaching ambitions. Objective 4, the Swedish question, kind of gives away what Peter's thoughts are on which direction Russia wants to expand into next, once the Ottomans have been defeated. In total, Peter and up to 30 nobles and members of the Duma would travel incognito across Europe, visiting various courts and holding talks with various monarchs. The route would see them travel to and through Riga, onto Königsberg, and then onto the Netherlands, over the Channel to England, before then travelling back to Holland, to Vienna, and then through the various German principalities. The intention was to also visit the great maritime and commercial power, Venice, but due to time constraints and delays on the road, this intention was eventually abandoned. Trying to travel in secret was made all the more difficult by Peter himself. By being almost 2 meters tall, it wasn't exactly easy to hide who he was. Still, this didn't end up actually being an issue. The embassy would leave Moscow on the 9th of March 1697, leaving Moscow and heading towards Riga, the capital of the Duchy of Livonia, then still nominally a part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but at the time was actually occupied by Swedish troops. The Swedish governor, General Dahlberg, refused Peter an audience and quarters, and thus the embassy hasn't got off to the best of starts and now heads on towards Courland. Like Livonia, Courland was, at this time, also a duchy within the Commonwealth. Unlike the welcome in Riga, when Peter and his entourage arrived at Mitava, modern-day Jihlava, they were welcomed openly, with a lavish feast thrown in Peter's honour as a conquering hero. Although not explicitly stated in the aims of the embassy, I can't help but feel that Peter's intention here, travelling through the two autonomous Commonwealth duchies, was to get a feel on how open they would be to switch their allegiance through to Russia. Treat this with a shovel load of salt though, it's pure speculation on my part. From Courland, it would take Peter almost a month to reach Königsberg, capital of Frederick III, Elector of Brandenburg, the same Frederick that would later become Frederick I of Prussia. Unlike in Courland, Peter entered the city without announcing who he was, and instead settled in private quarters, rather than approaching Frederick directly and asking for quarters within his palace. It wouldn't be until the 18th of May before Peter was able to meet Frederick. Now, this isn't really a case of Frederick keeping Peter waiting, but rather taking his time to prepare. The meeting, or rather ceremony, for that's what it actually was described with words such as spectacular, lengthy, and even grandiose. Unfortunately for Peter, the meeting came and went without any success. Although Frederick supported Peter's aims, to support them would have done so against his own objectives. Frederick, who wanted to expand Brandenburg's domain, wanted to do so at Poland's expense. Therefore, to wage war against the Ottomans would have been in not only Russia's interests, but also in Poland's. As a result of wanting, or rather needing, a weak, distracted Poland, Frederick refused to join the coalition that Peter was trying to build against the Ottomans. There would be some success, but no outright intention of joining Peter's attempts to build an alliance against Sweden. Whilst in Brandenburg, after leaving Königsberg, Peter would study the construction and use of modern artillery, recognising that although a powerful tool on the battlefield at the moment, Russia was actually only beginning to scratch the surface of what could be truly achieved. Peter, unhappily, would leave Prussia with only a trade agreement. As mentioned, Frederick was too distracted with his own Polish question and his attempts to become king of a new Prussian state, and thus raising his own profile within the Holy Roman Empire, to agree to any offensive wars as Russia's ally. Reaching the Rhine by the 7th of August 1697, Peter and his entourage would once again travel by boat rather than overland to reach the capital of the Netherlands, Amsterdam. The Netherlands at this time was one of, if not the largest trading partners of Russia already, being one of the few merchant naval fleets that braved the ice to regularly dock in Arkhangelsk. The stop in Amsterdam, however, would be a brief one. Travelling on to Zaandam before holding any council. It was Zaandam where many of the Dutch fleet was constructed. That was Peter's main fascination. He wanted an insight into how the nation constructed boats that regularly travelled the globe. Here, Peter himself would learn the trade of shipbuilding and, through much persuasion, eventually be able to convince several hundred shipwrights to travel to Russia for employment, with the intention of building Russia's own ocean-going fleet. Besides the hiring of the skilled workforce that Russia lacked, Peter would also purchase ship-going cannon for transport back to Russia, allowing them to be reverse engineered so that Russia could then arm her own fleet. Peter would spend some 4.5 months in the Netherlands, and not all of it studying shipbuilding. The beginnings of industry in the forms of windmills, factories and workshops were also of interest. The time spent studying their inner workings, processes and outputs. After the Netherlands, the next stop would be the court of King William III of England, arriving in early 1698. Staying for almost 3 months with time split between London and England's then main shipyard at Deptford, he would round off his education in shipbuilding. Despite the insight gained into life in both the Netherlands and England, the visit themselves were considered a failure. Both nations did not want any conflict with the Ottomans. In fact, both wanted peace concluded between Austria and them at the earliest opportunity because of their own intentions. That being, should Austria have peace on their southern border, they would then be free to wage war against France, who was both nations' main rival and competitor at the time. Travelling from England back to Holland and then through the great cities of Leipzig, Dresden and Prague before finally holding negotiations with the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I in Vienna. Negotiations were long and are oftentimes fraught. Austria had her own ambitions on any conquered Ottoman territory and, to Peter's chagrin, both the Straits of Kerch and any territory conquered in Anatolia were high amongst them. With Austria looking to claim the very land that Peter wanted to pursue war to gain, it would eventually see the negotiations concluded with no agreement in place. If anything, all they did was sow distrust between Peter and Leopold. Frustrated and unhappy that his attempts at forming a great alliance or coalition had largely been unsuccessful, Peter would head back to Moscow after almost 18 months on the road. However, and quite unexpectedly, on the travel back to Russia, Peter was invited to an audience with the Polish king Augustus II. With Peter's travel, embassy and its intentions now being pretty much common knowledge amongst the royalty of Europe, Augustus surprised Peter by not only offering to become Russia's ally, something that seemed preposterous at the start of this trip, but Augustus actually offered to instigate the conflict with Sweden by invading her lands. Despite the threat of a two-front war with the Swedes in the north and the Ottomans in the south, plans were drawn up for Poland to expel Sweden from the Duchy of Livonia, where Swedish influence had grown to the point that the duchy was now a part of the ever-expanding Swedish domain, but that Poland would recognise territorial expansion into Ingria and Estonia. A new conflict, one which will eventually envelop and involve much of Europe, is now brewing. On the 25th of August 1698, Peter would arrive back in Moscow in a much better mood than the one in which he'd left Vienna. Next week, we'll finally be getting into those reforms of Peter within the Russian state itself. I do hope you join me. Thanks again for joining me. As always, look for us on Twitter at RuhePoka or by searching for the Russian History Podcast. Emails with questions and queries can be sent to the Russian History Podcast at gmail.com. A special shout out to Brett G, who, amazingly, has been a patron of mine for some 13 months now. Thank you, Brett. You're the reason that I'm still going. As always, you can support the show by leaving a review on iTunes or by making a donation on Patreon, just as Brett has done. Both are a huge help to bring new people into the fold or to help with the expenses of running the podcast, and many thanks to each and every one of you that have left reviews or already joined me on Patreon. Thanks again. Ta-ra for now.